Good morning. This is our weekly webinar time, and today's topic is an open discussion on ungrading, which sometimes is a heated discussion. So we shall see, right? No, this isn't that controversial. This is supposed to be your coffee chat hour, right? But no, so this is our topic on ungrading, and today Bob is actually going to start us off and kind of explain somewhat on the ungrading so everyone's on the same page, and then we'll start off with open discussion. Bob, do you want to mention you had a nice article last week, I think, that you had brought up?
Yeah, thanks. Hi everyone. And Naomi, because last time I shared an article about ungrading, that was sort of an introduction. Naomi asked me to introduce the discussion today. I want to start off by saying I wouldn't consider myself an expert on this or something. I'm not even actually, I haven't practiced it a lot. I've tried to do little things to get rid of some grades and ranking in assignments where it's not necessary. But I find that the more I've been teaching since I've heard of this, the more I want to do it and the more uncomfortable I am with giving grades. And I wanted to start by sharing one recent experience with a project group in the first year design course at mechanical engineering. So sometimes these first year mechanical engineers, they come in without much sense for mechanical engineering or mechanisms or things that move and should not bend and everything they are going to learn. And then it can be a struggle, that first project, where they have to make something that actually works. So I had one of these groups, and they were really struggling with the project and they couldn't get it to work for quite some time, but they kept working on it enthusiastically. I tried to help them where I could, and in the end, they produced something that was actually quite nice. I mean, it wasn't great, but it worked, and I was so super proud of them. And also at the last meeting when I talked to them, it was a really nice discussion because they also knew what they learned, what they should still learn. Well, okay, that perhaps not so much, but a little bit they had an impression of that. And I gave them lots of compliments because I knew that they came very far from the start of the project. And then when I sat down to look at the reports and I saw their report next to others, compared to groups with people who already had a bit more of a sense of how materials work and how to connect things and how things might move and function mechanically. Yeah. If I was judging it purely based on the criteria that were set and in relation to the other groups, I couldn't give them more than a 7. It was just not. I couldn't justify something higher than a 7 or perhaps a 7.5 in relation to the work the other people did, and that just felt like such a betrayal to that group almost, because that grade it's not good feedback and. Also not good motivation. In fact, I'm afraid it will be detrimental to their motivation because they were developing an intrinsic motivation, and that extrinsic motivator of the grade, I'm afraid, gets in the way. And it also didn't express how much they learned because, of course, we judged the level at the end of the course, regardless of the level they have when they come into the course. So in all sorts of ways, I think grades don't do what they should do. They can be damaging, and it takes so much work. Like I love spending time with student work and with reports, but so much of the time goes into seeing, okay, if this is a 7.5 and that is an 8, then what is the difference? And if you would take that away, you could all put that into actual teaching, perhaps. So yeah, that was my most recent experience with why I don't like grading, and I think I want to try doing less of it or even none of it. And also the reason why I felt it might be interesting to have a discussion on it, because I'm very curious what other people's experience are, and perhaps even experience with trying to do less of it in their courses and how people have done that. So I'd be very curious if someone has something to share in that area.
Maybe I can kick off then. So I think my experience which also made me dislike grading is with the design synthesis exercise, which is the final bachelor project at aerospace engineering. So it's a 10-week, 10-person group project, where in the end everybody also gets an individual grade. 60% of the final grade is an individual grade. And what you end up with is you have lots of individual feedback to people. Where you say, okay, this is your strong points, this is your weaker points, and it's of course different for different people. And then in the end, everybody gets the same grade. And you spend a lot of effort in like trying to give everybody an individual grade, which then, because everybody's strengths and weaknesses are different, balances out to the same in the end. Do you think I could just give them this feedback, and why do I put so much effort into coming up with a grade?
Well, this is one of the problems, right? Grades are one-dimensional. They're a one-dimensional scale from 1 to 10. And there's so much difference in what you would like to give as feedback to students that it all gets hidden within that grade. But the first response to a grade is always, oh, I am either happy with it or I'm kind of disappointed with it. And you don't, it sort of gets in the way of actually receiving that multi-dimensional feedback. Is that a fair interpretation of what you just described?
Yeah, pretty much.
Maybe I can add also something to the discussion. I am teaching a course in the second year of applied physics, design engineering for physicists, and it is over 1 quarter. And the students have to build an instrument to measure something. And it's composed of many small tasks they have to do. They have to learn also something about intellectual property, about the life cycle assessment of the instruments they make. They have to do physics calculations to show that it's working. They have to make drawings of the instrument. So there are all kinds of small things they have to deliver. And with some of these tasks, they will be graded, and other parts are not graded. And if I'm honest, and I must say that I don't see that much difference in the parts that we grade and the parts that we don't grade, with how well the students participate in the task they have to do. So I'm getting also more the feeling that we should grade less. But on the other hand, if things are not graded, sometimes they have to do something, and then we give them feedback. Then they have to report on how they have designed the instrument. And we only give feedback, okay, this was clear or not. And then all these parts are put together in a report that we do grade, but that's indeed a lot of work. And in the end, all of them are intermediate level, so it doesn't matter too much. But if my worry sometimes is that if we don't grade some things, that students don't work. They have so many different things they want to do. And that's a little bit where I'm torn apart.
Yeah, can I just latch on to that one from a comment from Wim, because in the course that we teach, which again is similar, it's group work where students have to do, which it's a project that takes them 3 months to do, and we provide them feedback as they go along when they do the different components. For a couple of years, we actually didn't grade the sub-reports that the students submitted. We just gave them an indication as to you're on the right track or you're not on the right track. And in the feedback sessions, we always told them which parts needed more attention and just all positive feedback. But the students actually preferred to get some sort of mark, some sort of grade for them to an indication. If we said you're on the right track, they said, yeah, but is it a 6? Is it a 7? Is it an 8? That's irrelevant to us because we're only going to grade your final product. And we've had students in the past who've had their sub-reports consistently poor, always saying, we're always the type of sub-reports where we always have to say, sorry, you're not on the right track, it's not good enough, you haven't addressed this, you haven't addressed that. And in the end, ended up with a final report, which was completely rewritten and ending up with a 7 or an 8 or even 9s we've had. But for some reason, the students didn't accept the fact that you can get persistently low rating for your sub-reports and have a high mark for your final report. I said that doesn't work. So in the end, we ended up giving sub-grades, even though we don't do anything with it. And it's sort of like, you know, okay, we think it's worth a 7, because it's the final mark is not an average of all the sub marks. It's something that we throw away again. But the students actually prefer to say, okay, so we're now at level 7, and that's good enough for us. Or we're at level 8, so we're doing okay. And we found, as a matter of fact, that it took away the incentive for students to actually work on the parts that were missing. If they'd written a sub part really well, the last thing we want for them is to become overconfident, because the different components are different. You know, that's like a restart again. And you can be very good at the non-technical aspects, but if you then have to address the technical aspects and you fail, yeah. So it's for us, it's a struggle. The students want to be graded because they want to know where they stand, and we felt that it was sufficient if we just told them you're doing well or you're not doing well.
But if I understand correctly, you don't register those subgrades. You just sort of throw them out there and then they're gone.
But they're in the system. We use, in our case, because it's not a TU Delft course, it's done by, the administration is done by another university, so we use Blackboard, but it's recorded in Blackboard and it's not taken into the final mark. So it's there in Blackboard, the students can see it.
Know this, that the grades they don't add up to anything?
Yeah, we tell them right from the start, saying, okay, bear in mind that your final grade is based on your final report. It has nothing to do with your sub-reports. This is just purely for your own information. But the students actually wanted to have those sub-marks. So yes, they're recorded and we don't do anything with it. We don't average them. We just ignore them. So but the students like it.
Because then you're using it purely as a feedback mechanism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's also one of the reasons why. I mean, we do have an assessment rubric we use, but it's let's just put it this way: it's applied very loosely. We definitely, because for us it's more important to have the feedback session with the students where we tell them what they've done well and what can be better, than whether it's a 7 or a 7.5. To us, that's not relevant. We just want to know where the students stand and what their next step in the project is going to be. But as I said, we try to eliminate marks, sub-marks at least altogether, and students didn't like it.
It's a common theme in also other writing about this topic.
But what we did manage to do, though, is because the students did the group work, and very intensive project. It takes them 3 months to do, and they really have to spend a lot of effort into doing it. We abolished the final exam, which was an individual exam, because we found that didn't actually test anything anymore. Anything the students had to learn, they applied during the course of the project. It's just that we couldn't assess them individually to see whether they've individually picked up all the skills or not. That's why we still had a final exam, individual final exam. But we abolished that a few years ago because we felt it was too much of a burden for the students to still study for the exam after they finished their project. And it's students didn't mind that. Strangely enough, they were very much in favor of dropping the final exam. But it does mean that it's harder for us to assess the students individually. We'd have to sort of take that we just have to assume that everyone did equal work. We do have for the students a feedback form where they have to do feedback, peer review, and they can indicate which students of the groups are lagging and which ones are not. So we can pick out the stragglers if we need to, and we give them some individual feedback.
Stefan, I see you mentioned 1 or 2 things in the chat, and you also mentioned an author, Alfie Kohn, which I'd also come across ages ago, one of the who writes a lot on this topic. So that gives me the impression that you've also been thinking about this. So I'm curious what your thoughts are.
actually my perspective on education since I've been an educator, somewhere 2005, is been on what I just wrote is the unconditioning from all kind of assumptions what schooling or education is. That's really difficult for students because it also presents to them some kind of value or self-worth. So imagine you are on the gymnasium, you score the 8s and 9s and 10s in maybe 12 subjects. So that's a lot of, you develop a self-image of how good you are. And then suddenly all these marks seem to not matter anymore. That's super difficult. So it would be the other way around. If the RNO gesprekken would give you a grade as an employee, you would think, what kind of crazy thing is this? How can this manager, professor grade me? He or she doesn't see me the whole year, maybe once in a while. This is ridiculous.
But even more specifically, I always also think about like the UTQ courses. We'd be super surprised to get grades there, wouldn't we? And we didn't.
Yeah, so from a motivation perspective, a lot of these theories or practices, they sound very logic, but the transformation from grading to ungrading, that's like very, very heavy psychologically. Someone raising their hand, Michael.
Yeah, Michael?
Yeah, this is a really interesting debate, and I actually heard and read about Jesse speaking about this kind of topic, and there's a particular article I posted about the FAQ, and I think it was saying that students start from like a really kind of anxious point when you mentioned that they're not going to grade. So I think he mentioned that like for the first kind of class or the first or second session, a lot of it is kind of a discussion about kind of why they're not grading and kind of how they're going to how things are going to work in that environment. But yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting thing. I think it's I think Jesse and others who are involved in the debate are kind of conscious that it's not just a kind of an immediate transformation, and maybe there's some kind of middle grounds as well, kind of removing some aspects of it, but not completely ungrading. But yeah, it's a really interesting debate. But yeah, really interested to kind of hear more thoughts on it.
Well, and one of the things, Michael, you mentioned, and also Stefan, you mentioned like the transformation from the normal way of doing it to a different, a challenging, scary way. The transformation is difficult. And Michael, one of the things that Jesse Stommel often mentions is like first thing to do is not to just stop grading. The first thing to do is talk to your students about the whole practice and what it does for them and what it doesn't do for them. Which means the remarks from Frederica are interesting. I've been meaning to do this, but with all the distance education and everything, I've been every time I thought, oh, that would be a good moment to talk to my students about it, it didn't work. So I was wondering whether other people have had conversations with students about this topic or other responses from them on grading practices.
Yeah, maybe I can just start a little bit. Is what I've been talking about, if I do something like less grading, depends on the course, is to have a discussion or a conversation about what value does it represent, the grade, and what value do we want to achieve in this course. And that's interesting how they perceive a grade. So changing the perspective of what does it represent or what's the purpose of the grade, that already opens a lot of assumptions. John.
Yeah, so the question about discussing with students about grades and whether they value them. The most discussion I've had with that has been with a couple of master students. Especially where in aerospace engineering, first they do a literature review, which gets graded, and then they go on to the actual thesis. And there I've had some students where we give individual feedback on what they've done, and they indicate, yeah, I'm not too interested in the grade. Obviously, I want to pass, but other than that, I'm interested in getting the feedback and not so much in the grade. So there you need to see that they were open. If we wouldn't have given a grade with only feedback, at least those particular students would have been just as happy, I think. But that's a very individual setting, because it's the master thesis where you're really one-on-one with the students. And they're also, at the end of their master, probably have a different outlook than students.
Roel.
And then Roel?
I have a question, if I may, because I don't have experience with not grading students, only pass-fail gradings instead of grades. But I'm director of a program, and as a consequence, I get like 20 letters a year or something from students that want to study their masters abroad, and they have to have some sort of letter stating how well they've studied, and that's always about the average, right? The GPA they got for their grade, and I have to indicate how many top percent they belong to. And that's like the big number that all these universities look at. If you're not in the top 10, you have no chance. So if we want our students after their bachelor's to go to Harvard, we need to give them a GPA, because they don't enter there. So not grading is a serious problem for our excellent students to show their excellence. So I have a question what you think about that. And the other aspect that I think is below this, and I'm not sure, but when I hear your examples of not grading, it seems to be about projects and not so much about the theoretical subjects. And I want to test whether this is true, because if this is true, then the average grade will be based on your knowledge tests and not so much on your skill tests. And I doubt whether that is a good thing to do. So I'd like to hear your responses on this.
So actually, I do want to bring this up because the conversation now has been shifted from the actual topic of ungrading overall to the logistics. And this is one part I was going to bring up about 10:30 or 10:45 because of this exact factor that sometimes technology requires certain things. I hear you with the program requiring certain things. And I also heard you say something about the project versus like an exam. One of the things that I question on this is sometimes the lecturer may not be aware of if the course was originally all aligned that it was supposed to have an exam, but that doesn't really work. The process of adjusting that to a project-based course or adjusting any parts of the syllabus specifically to the assignments may take a full year to actually make those adjustments. So I do wonder if the ungrading topic is also related to logistical failures that we see along the way of either it needs to be adjusted and the lecturers maybe need more freedom in like redesigning the assignments so that it doesn't take a year for the whole process to take place. Or is this also the question for me is it something that outside of the university, it's been determined that it should be graded by an exam, not a project? And is that where the pressure is coming from? So I'm just adding more questions to this group.
John.
Yeah, I think in response to the last question, there are lots of places that want to see a relative ranking of students. And the logical way of doing that, the way the world does that now, is by giving students a grade, because then you can objectively say this student got a higher grade than that student, therefore they're the best. And like Roel said, you see it at admissions for, let's say, masters and PhDs from, I don't know what TU Delft requires actually on our side, on our entry, but I know especially American universities, they want to know, are you in the top so much percent? And if they have templates for recommendation letters, they always want to see in what percentage of students do you rank the student. And I think also some employers have the same. They want to see, I don't know, grades or a ranking or something like that. And yeah, if we ungrade, then we somehow have to still either provide that information or convince all these other people that they shouldn't be asking for it, which is not something easy to do, right? But
Well, but it is the question, like, is it our job to sort of put our students in order from best to last for other people? Is that what we're here for? If it, and especially if there are lots of negative side effects from that practice. Like if there were no negative side effects, fine. But the practice in and of itself, creates also a competitive atmosphere that can be detrimental to what you're trying to do in a class. And Roel, you mentioned, I don't have experience with this, but other than pass-fail grading, well, for me, when I think of grading, I really think about ranking, like putting students in order. So if you have a pass-fail assessment, whether people learned what they should learn, you can't, well, that seems, for lots of types of education, it seems necessary and logical to certify that people learned what they should learn. So if you have a pass-fail system, like the UTQ courses, for instance, you pass those, which is a certification. Okay, now you have a certain minimum level of knowledge and skill that you can tell the outside world. So you can do that certification function without saying where in the order people are. And to get to your project and theory courses question, I'm going to link something else. I'll link first, because I wrote a column about this a while back, but I'll also link to the actual paper. Everyone should get an A, which is actually much more specific about courses that teach theory and specific skills like maths and physics, where the grade at the end of a course, he argues, isn't really a measure of how good the student is at that topic. It's also a measure of how much they already knew when they got into the course, or how quiet their life was during the course, or whether their grandma died during the course. So he argues actually grading fails our students in different ways, specifically in theory courses, and we should organize it in a way that everybody gets an A, which is sort of the pass-fail certification for knowing the topic. Because with what I see in exam courses for theory courses, which I'm only sideways involved in, but their grades give a very bad signal about how much they know of the theory, because if you get a 7, you never know what they failed at, and that 30% is different for each student. So then the course after that gets a mix of students where that 30% failure is sort of, well, it's not equally distributed, but there can always be important gaps. And there are also courses where you never know whether they got 7 out of 10 questions fully correct, or they got all the questions 70% correct, right? So even their grades are a very bad signal and certification tool.
I have a question. Let's lower my hand. Oh, lower. Away hand, yeah. So, for instance, just to get in the shoes of the people we grade, let's suppose we are back in the UTQ, we get all this grading, then we get a sort of distribution of good teachers, bad teachers, etc., etc. How would that be for us?
That would suck.
Would I select the good teacher in my team and, you know, move all the bad teachers who just got a 6, move them to the course of Bob?
So this is an interesting topic because I've actually seen this in the US where it was published, but it was for high school, I think it was, where they rated the teachers and then they published it in the newspaper. You can imagine how well that went. So it is possible that some people do these plans, and rating people. I do agree it may not be the best route because, either everyone floods one system and then drops out of the other, or it makes,
the question
obviously waves.
Would be what is the purpose of the grading? Why would we do it? Because
and why share?
So I see you have a big smile, so I imagine you mean it's kind of ridiculous to line up all the teachers at the beginning of the the academic year. So these are the teachers we have at TU Delft. You start at the bridge, the canal, with the lowest one, and the highest one is, you know, in the front of the aula.
There's actually a website in the US as well that was rateyourprofessor, I think, .com. And so you can look at your university and then pick out who is the better one for some of the core courses that you have. It doesn't actually go through like more specific stuff, but the basic courses that everybody has to take, you'll at least see 4 professors and it will list out like the ratings and like you can see some comments. I was fascinated again why this was an issue and why it was out there. Because logistically too, usually you hear about like an inspiring professor and that word gets out. So I am kind of curious why bother rating it and why make it public. I would agree as well on that.
Yeah, so going further with the question of Bob or John is, so we grade stuff, but we also know there's a lot of things we cannot value with grading. Then what happens most of the time, at least as far as I know, is people identify their own image with the grade. So like I'm an average, I'm only like a student of a 6 or a teacher about a 6. So that it sort of lowers the self-image and the motivation, etc., etc. So, and if we know we cannot measure everything, so what do we think we measure with the grade? So if we start thinking of ungrading, what do we gain with it, or what do we miss with grading? Because I see happy faces like, there would be a relief of all the heavy workload with grading, would be super. I would just give some talk and feedback, phew. But we also lose something.
Can I say something about it?
Yeah.
I was just wondering because what if we would, because basically, if I understand it correctly, I try to summarize it. You're basically saying that it's if we give students 1 grade for a project which you do with multiple people, which is an average of everything basically, that's not very nice. And I know that some students who are really good performing students sometimes complain about that they always get low marks, you know, 8, very low. And that their GPA is getting lower because of that. And what you're basically saying, what I hear, if I hear it correctly, is that students want feedback on competence that are relevant for their future work environment, basically. So, because maybe there's also a relation to not so much to the GPA only, but also on how well they will do in the jobs that they will have afterwards. So what if we would not give 1 grade to them, but multiple grades that relate to really or no grade, but like very short feedback that would be in their grade list, in the final grade list that they get with the diploma, that would state how well they perform on certain aspects that are relevant in the work field. But would that be more or less work for lecturers? Because, well, that's a wild idea.
Well, I think that would be more work probably. And again, the first question that pops into my mind in response to that is that our job? Like, is it our job to send out our students into the world along with a list of things that we think they are good and bad at? So if companies want to select people that are good at something specific, well, let them organize a selection process. I mean, if they want that, then they can go right ahead and organize that. And I work for my students, and what I want to give them is as much insight into what they're doing and how they're developing as I possibly can. and that is, if I put them in order, so ranking gets in the way of that. And it's not just that some things, because we could give them multiple grades, like for different aspects or sub-skills of a course. That might already be a bit better, because then you're not a 7 student or an 8 student. There's already a bit of a variation. But still, I think the most valuable feedback that students learn the most of, sometimes they don't know that that's something they should learn. And it's also often something that I didn't see coming at the start of the course. So it's very difficult, and this goes especially for project courses. It's very difficult to say beforehand which categories are the ones that I want to give feedback in, because often it surprises me what they do and how they do something well or how they do something poorly. Every year someone misunderstands me in a new way that yeah, surprises me.
So I put up a question.
Yeah, this is a good question to say, because
So-
I was going to ask the same thing. I love that you do it. So I'm passing it over to you, Stefan.
Okay, so we learn a lot of things in university. Of course, a lot of knowledge, a lot of skills. And since we're talking about competences which we acquire, of course, there's also behavior involved. How about grading behavior? John, you've been a bad boy. What do you think about it?
Oh, we can't hear you, John.
Yeah, so you
Helps
failed.
unmute yourself. Yeah, minus 1 point for me. I forgot to unmute. So actually, in the design synthesis exercise, we to a certain extent do that. So like I said, we have this individual grade everybody gets, and there's a huge rubric that's been set up, because it's the whole faculty is involved in this course almost. It's really big. And one of the things on the rubric that goes into individual mark was like your attitude during the project, and did you pull your weight, and did you communicate with your teammates, or did you just sit off on your own little island? And so there's a rubric, and you pick from the boxes, and a grade rolls out. So whether we should is a different matter, but at the moment we do, and we can to a certain extent. Right? I think you can say, you can come up with criteria and say, this is behavior we want to see, behavior we don't want to see, and then if you really want to, you can put that onto a gradable scale. Whether that's a useful thing to do, it's a different matter. But
And I see a hand raised, but is it Norbert?
Adrian, it's Adrian.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it would be disastrous if we start to grade behavior, because students will find out what we'll grade them on, and they'll start to behave exactly like they think we want them to behave. And I've seen examples of that, and I think we should never, ever even consider it.
But I do think that's part of the ungraded then of the natural part of education, because in some ways you probably give the feedback, but you don't necessarily give the A or the
Yes.
10 or the 6. But it seems like the social and emotional part of it is contributed in some way through feedback. Because you can have a 10 on all the exams, but if the behavior, like I would assume that there would be some sort of conversation regarding behavior if needed.
No, I definitely believe in giving students feedback, of course. But as soon as you start to grade and design rubrics, because you need underlying rubrics to justify your grading, then students are going to just like, oh, I have to. It's like we started to grade, so to speak, participation in small group learning. And students told each other, you have to speak up at least 3 times during a class, and then you get a. I was like, okay, great. This is really what we want. People to kind of like, yeah. No. It's like zombie behavior.
It's the I agree comment in the discussions as well. That's like, it counts technically, but no, it does not count. It should not count. You have to actually argue or discuss or add something to it. Yeah.
Yeah, or listen for a change and not add something, but just listen to what others have to say. That's also really good academic quality. But
It definitely is.
yes.
Yeah, and it depends
So
on,
here-
like, some people should listen more and some people should talk more.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
But I also hear you talk about rubrics. So maybe we can also bring that up in this ungrading piece. Yes, Bob, we're talking about rubrics
Well,
today.
I was just going to say rubrics are a whole different discussion, and why they're by definition they don't work. But you do need them for if you want to give grades or something like them. And yeah, without getting into all the details of why I think rubrics are bad, what they require is that what Adrian also said a minute ago, you need to sort of beforehand decide what counts, right? Literally what counts, because you're counting, you're giving a quantitative judgment, even if it's like A through F or good, medium, bad, it's still quantitative. While, especially with behavior, but with with lots more things we want students to learn, and students want to learn themselves. It's very difficult to decide beforehand what counts. Like I said, it's always surprising what ways a group is, in what ways a group functions well or functions poorly. And it depends on specific interactions and contextual factors as well. And none of that is reflected in quantitative grades, especially when you have to define beforehand what counts. And it becomes a struggle, and it creates an adversarial relationship. I think Stefan commented at some point in the chat something about collaboration, and grades almost by definition create an adversarial relationship because students want to get high ones, and we have to defend our judgments and make them legalistically airtight.
Yeah, so one thing is two values we think agree on, we enjoy much is ownership but also co-creation. So that's an interesting paradox. Because sometimes students interpret ownership like working on their own. And co-creation is like, oh, now I become dependent of the quality of the other person. So, but on the other hand, things we value are like, he or she was like the engine of the group, or he or she kept the group together, was the guide through all these cliffs, etc., etc. So that's also a lot of knowledge and skills involved. But how to teach, how to measure, how to grade a thing like that. So if you would put a grade on it, it would emphasize. You would also say, like people like, you were very bad at this. So it might take away the what we say, what you said, Bob, if you put it in a rubric, like the possibility of new emergent knowledge, which of course we are not as teachers, Mr. and Mrs. Know-it-all. So interesting new angles. Actually, the creativity might be a little bit lower. Anyway, I talk too much. Norbert.
I totally agree about the cooperation, like doing it together. And it's not perfect yet, but we started this program in first year student group where we have the students think about what do they value in cooperation. And then they sort of get to design their own rubric. And of course, we sort of watch it as well through our eyelashes to see if that's not completely nonsense. But usually it's not. They come up with really things that we would come up ourselves, but because they made it themselves, there seems to be a little bit more ownership. I'm saying it's not perfect yet, but we're working on it, and they really like it. And we also asked them, like, how would you like to be getting feedback from your other students, from us, etc.? How shall we do this? And then just the conversation is so valuable. And in the end, it's not about the rubric that they produce, it's about the conversation that they had about it. For some of them, it's the first time they really talk about, oh, how do we want to work together? Because they've always been told by teachers, this is the rubric, this is how you should cooperate. And they're like, okay. I love it.
Frederica?
Yeah, we actually use students have to do a peer review of how they're performing or how their group mates perform. But one of there's many questions we ask in the self-assessment form, and one of them is actually not so much, apart from how much input did the other group mate deliver into the project, but it's also about how well did they manage to motivate the other ones, because we also acknowledge that not every student is equally active within the project during the 3 months, but it can also have more of a motivational role or making sure that time management is kept to. So we do ask those kind of skills as well. And it's actually quite interesting to see how you get very different opinions within one group. And a number of years ago, we had one group that was completely taken over by one student who felt that the other 3 students were performing below par and not doing the work that he expected the other students to do. And it was quite interesting to see that the other students had exactly the same feeling, that this guy was taking over and was bullying them and not open to their own input. So it gave us a nice idea how the group dynamics worked within the group, and how after a while the groups kind of fell into 2 groups, and you had one couple doing some work and one person still trying to latch on to this leader of the group and trying to match his standards. But it was quite interesting. In the end, the group did receive a good mark because the work they delivered was excellent. But in the feedback, we did sort of say, you have to allow for more input from other students as well. Yeah, but it's we use this self-assessment, and students are brutal when they self-assess. That's sometimes it's very nice.
Actually, it is kind of interesting to note that for self-assessment, it also, the reports that I've seen and analysis on it, it tends to be that females rate themselves lower than males when they self-assess. I've seen it in my grading in some places, and I have to adjust it to at least equalize when I do see that. But I do tend to see it's like a full letter grade sometimes, or they even fail themselves, whereas others don't. So.
Well, but that does sound super valuable in the sense, because that gives you something that they've externalized that you can now talk about, right? When they self-assessed as something that makes you go, whoa, 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 no, that's way too low. You can have a productive conversation about how they view themselves or their level of performance.
Yeah, definitely.
In contrast to when we give like the grade, that's the truth, right? And that's it, and it's the one and only truth.
Yeah. So if you want to have ownership and people taking some things in their own hand and be realistic to the self, then the ungrading might be a very scary thing, because the self-reflection is not always a nice image.
No, you're right.
So
yeah, I know. I noticed that we've been talking a lot about group projects and open-ended projects. So not necessarily in a group, but like design projects and other things that are open-ended and not a math exercise or something. So I was wondering whether anyone has perhaps some examples or thoughts about the other end of the spectrum, when there are more specific bits of knowledge or skill involved that are not so open-ended. Because the one that popped into my mind when I thought about this, in that design course that I teach, there's also sort of a sub little course on drawing. Students need to learn to draw to design stuff. And those are actually quite rigid exercises where they make isometric drawings by hand. And those there are 3 of them, and they used to all get a grade. and then 2 needed to be a 6 or higher to pass that part of the course, which was a lot of work, because then, okay, who gets a 7, who gets a 6? And we had TAs, but it was a lot of work for the TAs. So we changed that with none of them get grades anymore. They all get pass fail. Only the 3rd one counts, because that's the highest level one anyway, and that's the level we want. So if you pass that, you've passed. But we do give each of them feedback on a few criteria, like your line work, the construction, the complexity, and then there's, I think, a very rough quantitative level of, okay, this is sufficient, this is really excellent, or this really needs work. And I was afraid that students would not do the exercises because they don't count towards the grade. And we'd see other effects that we didn't want, but actually the results are quite similar as they were before. And I like the freedom it gives students to just go, okay, I don't think this is important. I don't want to spend my time on this. I'm just going to do easy exercises to get to pass. And yeah, that's also valid sometimes. And you see other students that used to get the 8s and the 9s, they're still enthusiastic about it. So they still put in the work, and we give them a bit of extra encouraging feedback. And they still produce brilliant work. So that was a fun experience for a much more limited, directed skill, where there was actually 0 effect in the results, but lots of effect in the work it created for us.
Stefan, do you want to?
Yeah. So I was wondering, where does the assumption come from that if we don't give grades, students will not put their effort in learning stuff? That's why we're here, to learn stuff.
Well, I think it is true that in lots of circumstances, if we don't give a grade for something, students don't do it. But I think that often happens because there's too much for them to do. So there's like 50 hours of work in the week to do everything. So when they're selecting the things that they're going to put their 40 hours into,
but
it sort of
why?
makes sense to do it for the things you're going to get punished for if not doing.
You do it for show.
Oh, you do to avoid the punishment of a low grade.
So it's about punishment. So that's a good motivation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have the same experience as Bob with course that I give on electricity and magnetism. In the years before, we had bonus grades for the homework they did. And last year we had to stop with the bonus because we couldn't check if the students were there when they made the homework. And they participated in just the same amount as in earlier years. So all these subgrades, they didn't help for the active participation of the students. So I think that some cases I was grading too much.
John?
Right.
Yeah, I was wondering, because Stefan, you said, why are students here? They're here to learn. Hopefully that is true. But I think for quite some students, at least part of the reason why they're here is because it is socially expected, and because if you want a job, a diploma is your gateway to, right, is the gatekeeping between getting a good job or not. And that probably also changes, your motivation. If you're here because I like engineering, I want to become a better engineer, then you'll do the work. If you're here because if I want to earn enough money to be able to buy a house later, I need this diploma. Yeah, if I don't get a grade, then it doesn't count towards my diploma, so then I don't need to care about it. If I, it may be hyperbolic, but
yeah, it's interesting.
That could be part of the reason why students say, well, it doesn't count for anything, so why do it?
Well, not grading does not mean things are not obligatory or you don't assess a certain level.
Yeah. No, I was responding to specifically the question about why do students care so much about a grade sometimes, or why do we think students care about a grade?
Yeah, I'd like to add that partly that answer for me is in the fact that it's not so much that they care about the grade, but we care about the grades, and that's why they care about the grades. If we stop caring, I mean, it's really hard to get out of a system. And there's a lot of research where you see that if you take away testing or grades or just a lot of students start to be less motivated, but that's within the system where we say, you do this, we test you, and then you get a grade, and then you get to Harvard or whatever. So, and I find that really challenging. How do we break out of this system? Because as long as we're in the system, it's not going to happen. Students are going to say, yeah, whatever, but at the end, it's about the grade. So you can talk to me about motivation and blah, blah, blah. So, and that for me, that takes a lot of courage. And I'm a very lucky and privileged teacher because I teach a program that is about teaching and testing. So I can experiment like crazy. So in my course, I really ask the students the question, so, okay, so how do you want to be tested and graded? Come up with a nice design and I'll approve of it. And that's how it goes. And some of them say like, no, you do it. You're the teacher. You tell me what to do. Fine, that's also fine. But some of them like, I would like to write a blog about Lala. I'm like, okay, be my guest. Well, of course, the exam committee is not happy with it, but I get away with it because it is a course about teaching. So,
but you're not here to make the exam committee happy.
Oh, great!
You're also, here to provide good teaching.
Yes.
While keeping them happy enough that they don't bother us.
Yeah.
So I like that our discussion, like we said, we had some open parts of the discussion, and then we've kind of falled back into some of the logistics doesn't necessarily fit. And having the exam committee, sometimes I hear that too, is like some logistically doesn't always fit. So part of ungrading is actually the structure of the system, perhaps the structure of the technology that includes part of the grading. From the learning developer side, there's clearly some platforms that are better with grading than others. So that can provide some challenges. The rubrics inside of those platforms sometimes are better than others. So those are things that we see from the learning developer side. John, I'll give you the floor in just one second, but we're getting close to the end for the recording. So I just want to make sure everyone is aware. Next week's topic is the TU Delft's Game Lab, Building Simulation and Games for Researchers. And that's going to be led with Simon Timmersma. Still working on Dutch names, sorry guys. But he's got a great topic coming up, and that is the last one of this year. And then we will be coming back to the weekly webinar starting in January. We have two that will be on more of the assessment. I believe Saskia is going to be talking about fast grading, and then Lisette will be also talking about some of the assessment policies and anything else coming up for different assessments. So you'll see those invites later. But you'll see that starting off in January. So John, I'll pass it over to you for closing thoughts here, and then we'll end the recording.
Yeah, so my thought was a bit about, was mentioned just now about, we're in a system, and that system is why students, the system values grades, and therefore for students value grades. And I think it's good to realize that the system is bigger just than us as the university, right? It also includes where students go next. And of course, Bob also mentioned about, is it our job to rank students? And I agree with a lot of your arguments why we shouldn't do it. But as a practical example, here in the Netherlands, some of you may know we have different levels of senior school. And the traditional way that is decided where you go to is we have this thing called the CITO-toets at the end of elementary school. When you're 12, you do this test series of exams and you get a score, and then that's how you can go. So my elementary school actually ungraded. They didn't do any grades at all. No, they didn't have any grades at all. You got a report, but in feedback, but not grades. And part of that was they also did not do the CITO-toets, which was fine. They just gave an advice from your teacher at the end of the year. You go to school, which is fine, excepting that when I went to go to the gymnasium, they said, yeah, but this is just the word of a teacher. We want more. And so there was quite
still you made it to the university.
Yeah, so in the end, what happened was that I had to sit an entrance exam to get into this high school, instead of all the other kids who came from different junior schools had their CITO score and got in. I had to do an entrance exam, and then I passed that and got in. But yeah, the school's decision not to give me a grade had an impact on me as a student.
That's definitely an interesting perspective. So for those of you watching the recording, thank you for being with us here.